In the decaying streets of Detroit, where abandoned houses stand like broken teeth in the urban landscape, three young people have found their calling in the art of breaking and entering. Rocky is a young woman with dreams bigger than her circumstances, trapped in a home where her alcoholic mother serves as a constant reminder of everything she wants to escape. Her baby sister Didi represents the only pure thing in her world, the motivation that drives her to take increasingly dangerous risks. Beside Rocky stands Alex, a young man whose father runs a security company, providing them with the keys that make their illegal ventures possible. His feelings for Rocky run deep, though she remains focused on money, her reckless boyfriend who brings both passion and danger to their small criminal enterprise. Money embodies everything that makes their criminal lifestyle both appealing and ultimately destructive. He carries himself with the confidence of someone who believes he can outsmart any system, his swagger masking the desperation that drives all three of them to steal from those who have what they lack. The trio has developed a system that works, targeting homes in wealthy neighborhoods where Alex's inside knowledge of security systems gives them a significant advantage. They steal electronics, jewelry, and cash, but never enough to truly change their lives, always living paycheck to paycheck in the world of petty crime. Detroit serves as more than just a backdrop for their story. It becomes a character in its own right. The city's economic collapse has left entire neighborhoods abandoned, creating a landscape where the desperate prey on each other and the vulnerable become victims of circumstance. In this environment, the three friends have learned to survive by taking advantage of those who appear weak or defenseless, a philosophy that will soon be tested in ways they never imagined. The opportunity that changes everything comes through Money's network of criminal contacts. Word reaches him about a potential score that could solve all their problems in one night. Deep in the heart of Detroit's most desolate area, where entire blocks have been abandoned to decay and silence, lives an elderly blind man who recently received a substantial cash settlement. The man's daughter was killed in a car accident, struck down by a wealthy young woman whose family's money helped her avoid serious consequences. The settlement money, rumored to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sits somewhere in the man's house like a treasure waiting to be claimed. The plan seems almost too simple to be real. The man lives alone in a house surrounded by abandoned properties, with no neighbors to witness their crime and no one to hear any noise they might make. His blindness, they reason, gives them an enormous advantage. They can move freely through his home while he stumbles around in darkness that means nothing to him but everything to them. The settlement money will be their ticket to a new life, enough to get Rocky and Didi away from their toxic home environment and set all three of them up with the means to leave Detroit behind forever. As they prepare for what they hope will be their final job, the three criminals fail to consider the possibility that appearances can be deceiving. The blind man they plan to rob is Norman Nordstrom, a Gulf War veteran whose loss of sight came not from birth or accident, but from the violent realities of military service. His blindness has not made him weak or helpless. Instead, it has forced him to develop his other senses to an extraordinary degree. Every sound in his house has meaning. Every creak of the floorboard tells him where someone is standing, and every breath taken by an intruder becomes as obvious to him as a shout would be to someone with sight. The house itself has become an extension of Norman's defensive capabilities. He knows every inch of the layout, every potential hiding place, and every route of escape. What appears to the outside world as the humble home of a disabled veteran is actually a fortress designed to protect both its occupant and the secrets he keeps hidden in its depths. The young criminals approaching his door have no way of knowing that they are walking into a trap that has been years in the making. On the night, they choose to execute their plan. Detroit's abandoned streets provide the perfect cover for their approach. The nearest occupied house sits blocks away, and the streetlights that still function cast long shadows that help conceal their movement. They arrive at Norman's house with confidence born of previous successes, each carrying the tools of their trade and the assumption that this job will follow the same pattern as all the others. Alex's hands shake slightly as he uses his father's keys to disable the alarm system, not from fear but from anticipation of the freedom that the money inside will bring. The exterior of Norman's house gives no indication of the horrors that wait within. Like many homes in the area, it shows signs of age and modest means. with a small yard that Norman maintains despite his disability and bars on some windows that speak to the security concerns of living in an abandoned neighborhood. The young criminals see these bars not as protection for the occupant, but as confirmation that something valuable lies within, worth protecting from other criminals who might have the same idea they do. Money takes the lead as they approach the house, his natural aggression making him the de facto leader when violence becomes necessary. Rocky follows close behind, her thoughts focused on the new life this money will buy for her and her sister. Alex brings up the rear, his technical knowledge making him invaluable for bypassing security measures, but his gentler nature making him less suited for the violent aspects of their work. Together they represent different aspects of the criminal mindset, united by desperation, but divided by their willingness to cross certain moral lines. The first sign that this job might be different comes when they discover that Norman has a dog, a large and well-trained animal that serves as both companion and security system. The dog's presence forces them to adjust their plans, requiring them to use tranquilizers to neutralize the animal without raising an alarm. This deviation from their usual methods should serve as a warning, but their focus on the potential reward blinds them to the increasing signs that Norman is not the helpless victim they expected to find. Inside the house, Norman moves through his daily routine with the precision of someone who has spent years adapting to his disability. He knows the location of every object, the sound of every pipe and board, and the patterns of light and shadow that his limited vision can still detect. His military training has never left him, and his time in combat has given him an understanding of tactical thinking that his would-be robbers completely lack. When he senses the presence of intruders in his home, his response is not panic, but the cold calculation of a soldier preparing for battle. The house's interior layout becomes crucial to the deadly game that unfolds. Norman has arranged his furniture and belongings not for comfort or aesthetics, but for tactical advantage. He can move through the rooms in complete darkness, while his opponents stumble and crash into obstacles. Every room offers him potential weapons and defensive positions, while the intruders find themselves increasingly trapped in an environment that seems designed to work against them. The basement in particular holds secrets that will transform their simple robbery into a fight for survival. Money's aggressive approach serves him poorly in this new environment. His usual tactic of intimidation and violence assumes that his opponents will be frightened by his willingness to hurt people, but Norman has seen violence that makes Money's street crimes look like children's games. When the confrontation finally begins, Money discovers that his weapons and his attitude mean nothing against an opponent who has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of attack. The blind man moves through his house like a predator in familiar hunting grounds, while the intruders stumble around like prey that has wandered into the wrong territory. The first death comes quickly and brutally, serving notice that this will not be the easy score they anticipated. Norman's response to their invasion is swift and decisive, eliminating the immediate threat while demonstrating to the survivors that they have made a terrible mistake. The sound of gunshots in the enclosed space of the house seems impossibly loud, and the reality of what they have stumbled into begins to sink in for Rocky and Alex. What started as a simple robbery has become a life-or-death struggle against an opponent who knows his terrain and has no intention of letting them leave alive. Norman's military background becomes evident in the way he approaches the problem of eliminating the intruders. He does not simply react to their presence. He actively hunts them through the house, using tactics learned in combat zones far more dangerous than the streets of Detroit. His blindness, rather than being a handicap, becomes an advantage in the darkness he creates by shutting off the lights. In the pitch-black interior of the house, he moves with confidence while his sighted opponents become effectively blind, stumbling through rooms that he navigates by memory and sound. The basement reveals the true depth of Norman's psychological damage and the extent of the crimes he has committed in the name of justice. Hidden below the main house lies evidence of his obsession with replacing his dead daughter, a quest that has led him to commit acts that make the intruder's petty crimes seem insignificant by comparison. The young woman chained in the basement represents his attempt to create a new family through force and violence, a project that has transformed him from victim to perpetrator in ways that challenge any simple understanding of right and wrong. Rocky and Alex discover that their victim is actually a captor, holding prisoner the woman who killed his daughter in the car accident that destroyed his life. The woman, Cindy Roberts, was acquitted of serious charges due to her family's wealth and influence, a fact that drove Norman to take justice into his own hands. His plan to force her to bear him a replacement child reveals the depth of his mental breakdown and the extent to which grief has transformed him into something monstrous. The discovery of this crime forces the surviving intruders to question everything they thought they knew about their situation. The moral complexity of the situation becomes one of the story's most disturbing elements. The young criminals entered the house as predators seeking to victimize an innocent blind man, but they discover that their intended victim is guilty of crimes far worse than their own. Norman's status as a kidnapper and rapist transforms him from sympathetic figure to villain, while his blindness and military service complicate any simple judgment of his actions. The question of who deserves sympathy becomes murky when everyone involved has committed serious crimes for their own reasons. Cindy's death serves as a turning point in the story, eliminating any possibility of a simple resolution to the moral questions raised by the situation. When Norman accidentally kills her while shooting at the intruders, he loses the object of his obsession while gaining an even stronger motivation for revenge. Her death also eliminates the one witness who could testify to his crimes, leaving only the word of criminals against that of a disabled veteran. The tragedy of her death lies not just in the loss of life, but in the way it removes any chance for justice or redemption for any of the characters involved. The pursuit through the house becomes a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Norman using his superior knowledge of the environment to trap and hunt his prey. He demonstrates an understanding of psychological warfare, using darkness and sound to disorient and terrorize the intruders. His ability to move silently through the house while they crash into furniture and walls gives him a significant tactical advantage, while his military training allows him to anticipate their movements and cut off their escape routes. Alex's character development throughout the ordeal reveals the difference between someone who stumbles into crime and someone who embraces. His genuine feelings for Rocky motivate him to acts of heroism that contrast sharply with Money's selfish aggression, while his technical skills prove more valuable in their survival than brute force or intimidation. His evolution from reluctant criminal to determined protector provides one of the few positive character arcs in a story filled with moral ambiguity and violence. The house's basement becomes the site of Norman's most serious crimes and the place where the true nature of his character is revealed. The makeshift cell where he held Cindy prisoner demonstrates the premeditation behind his actions, while the artificial insemination equipment reveals the sexual nature of his crimes. The discovery of these items transforms the story from a simple home invasion thriller into something much darker, an exploration of how trauma and grief can transform victims into perpetrators. Rocky's motivation throughout the ordeal remains focused on survival and escape, but her discovery of Norman's crimes adds a layer of moral justification to her actions. She is no longer simply a criminal trying to avoid the consequences of her crime. She has become someone trying to escape from a situation far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. Her determination to survive and return to her sister provides an emotional anchor for the audience, even as the moral lines become increasingly blurred. The dog's role in the story serves multiple functions, acting as both obstacle and weapon for different characters at different times. Initially sedated by the intruders, the animal later awakens to serve its master's needs, pursuing the survivors through the house and adding another layer of danger to their escape attempts. The dog's loyalty to Norman contrasts with the betrayals and conflicts among the human characters, while its animal nature makes it immune to the moral complexities that complicate the relationships between the people. Norman's use of darkness as a weapon demonstrates his adaptation to his disability and his understanding of how to turn perceived weakness into strength. By shutting off the lights, he creates an environment where his blindness becomes irrelevant while his opponents lose their most important sense. This tactical decision transforms the house into his hunting ground, where every sound betrays the location of his prey while he moves in silence through familiar territory. The ventilation system becomes both refuge and trap for the survivors, offering concealment from Norman while creating its own dangers and limitations. Rocky's attempt to escape through the ductwork shows her desperation and resourcefulness, while the confined space adds claustrophobic tension to an already intense situation. The vents represent both the possibility of escape and the risk of becoming trapped in an even more confined space, with Norman potentially controlling both ends of any route she might take. The revelation of Norman's plan to force Rocky to replace Cindy as the mother of his replacement child adds a deeply disturbing element to the story. His preparation for artificial insemination shows the calculated nature of his crimes and his willingness to perpetuate cycles of violence and trauma. This threat transforms Rocky from criminal to victim, while demonstrating that Norman's apparent quest for justice has become something far more sinister and self-serving. Alex's apparent death and resurrection provide both dramatic tension and insight into Norman's psychology. The fact that Norman can be deceived, even with his heightened senses, shows that he is not invincible despite his advantages. Alex's survival also demonstrates that quick thinking and desperate courage can overcome even the most dangerous situations, while his ultimate sacrifice for Rocky's sake provides a heroic counterpoint to the story's darker themes. The final confrontation between Rocky and Norman becomes a battle between different kinds of desperation. Norman fights to preserve his secrets and maintain control over his environment, while Rocky battles for her freedom and her right to return to the life she was trying to escape. Both characters have been transformed by their experiences, with Rocky finding strength she never knew she possessed, and Norman revealing depths of depravity that his victim status had concealed. Norman's survival at the end of the story ensures that the moral questions raised by the events remain unresolved. His ability to convince authorities that he acted in self-defense demonstrates the power of perception and the difficulty of achieving justice when all the witnesses are either dead or criminals. The fact that he chooses not to mention Rocky's involvement suggests either mercy or strategic thinking, but his motivations remain unclear even as the story concludes. The news reports that follow the incident show how easily truth can be shaped by those who control the narrative. Norman's status as a disabled veteran makes him a sympathetic figure in the media, while the deaths of Money and Alex are portrayed as justified self-defense rather than the result of a complex situation involving multiple crimes by different parties. The simplification of the story for public consumption contrasts sharply with the moral complexity that the audience has witnessed. Rocky's escape to California represents both victory and defeat, as she achieves her goal of leaving Detroit while carrying the trauma and knowledge of what she experienced in Norman's house. Her possession of the stolen money provides the means for a new life, but the price paid for that money in terms of human life and moral compromise casts a shadow over her future. The question of whether she deserves her freedom becomes one that the audience must answer for themselves. The abandoned neighborhood where Norman lives serves as a metaphor for the moral wasteland that all the characters inhabit, just as the physical decay of Detroit has created spaces where normal rules do not apply. The emotional and psychological damage suffered by the characters has created a moral vacuum where traditional concepts of right and wrong become meaning. In this environment, survival becomes the only meaningful goal, and the methods used to achieve it become secondary to the result. The story's exploration of disability challenges audience assumptions about weakness and strength, showing how Norman's blindness has been transformed from limitation to advantage through years of adaptation and training. His ability to function effectively in his environment while his sighted opponents stumble helplessly demonstrates that physical disabilities do not necessarily translate to vulnerability, while his crimes show that victim status does not guarantee moral superiority. The economic desperation that drives Rocky, Alex, and Money to crime reflects broader social issues that extend beyond their individual choices. Their criminal activities are symptoms of a system that has failed to provide legitimate opportunities for advancement, while Norman's crimes stem from a justice system that failed to provide adequate punishment for his daughter's death. Both sets of crimes grow out of institutional failures that leave individuals to seek their own solutions to problems that society should address. The house itself becomes a character in the story, with its layout and contents revealing information about Norman's state of mind and his preparation for defending his secrets. The modifications he has made to accommodate his blindness also serve his defensive needs, while the basement prison shows the extent of his crimes. The building serves as both fortress and prison, protecting Norman from the outside world while trapping his victims within. The story's pacing builds tension through a series of revelations that continually shift the audience's understanding of the situation and the characters involved. Each new discovery about Norman's crimes or the intruder's motivations changes the moral calculation, while the physical action of the chase and fight sequences maintains forward momentum. The combination of psychological complexity and visceral action creates a viewing experience. The themes of justice and revenge permeate every aspect of the story, with different characters seeking different forms of satisfaction for the wrongs they have suffered. Norman's quest to replace his daughter through forced pregnancy represents one extreme of revenge-seeking, while Rocky's desire to escape her circumstances represents a more passive form of seeking justice. The collision of these different approaches to addressing life's unfairness creates the central conflict of the story. The cinematography and sound design of the film create an environment where every noise has significance and every shadow might conceal danger. The visual style emphasizes the claustrophobic nature of the house while highlighting the importance of non-visual senses in Norman's world. The careful attention to sound reflects the reality of how Norman experiences his environment, while the visual composition helps the audience understand the spatial relationships that are crucial to the action. The story's ending leaves questions about justice and morality unanswered, reflecting the complexity of real-world situations where clear-cut solutions do not exist. Norman's survival and Rocky's escape mean that both victim and perpetrator achieve their goals, while the system fails to provide adequate justice for any of the crimes committed. This ambiguous conclusion forces the audience to grapple with difficult questions about punishment, redemption, and the nature of justice itself. The film's exploration of urban decay and economic desperation provides context for the characters' actions. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods create an environment where normal social structures have broken down, allowing both petty crime and serious felonies to flourish in the absence of effective law enforcement or community support. The physical decay of the city mirrors the moral decay of the characters who inhabit it. Norman's military background adds layers to his character that complicates simple judgments about his action. His service to his country and the sacrifice of his sight in that service creates sympathy for his situation, while his crimes against Cindy and his plans for Rocky demonstrate how trauma can transform heroes into villains. The story suggests that society's failure to adequately support veterans dealing with trauma contributes to the cycle of violence that destroys lives on all sides. The relationship between Rocky and Alex provides the emotional core of the story, with Alex's unrequited love driving him to acts of heroism that ultimately cost him his life. Their dynamic shows how genuine emotion can exist even in morally compromised situations, while Alex's sacrifice demonstrates that people are capable of rising above their circumstances when motivated by love for others. His death serves as the story's greatest tragedy, eliminating the character with the strongest moral compass. The story's treatment of class issues reflects the economic realities that drive much criminal behavior, with the wealthy Roberts family able to buy their daughter's freedom, while the poor characters resort to crime to achieve their goal. Norman's cash settlement represents money that should have provided justice, but instead becomes the object of criminal desire, showing how economic inequality creates conflicts that damage everyone involved. The pursuit of money drives every character's actions, but none of them achieve the security and happiness they seek through material wealth. The psychological horror elements of the story grow out of the characters' gradual realization that they have entered a situation far more dangerous and morally complex than they anticipated. The discovery of Norman's crimes transforms him from sympathetic victim to terrifying predator, while the intruder's own criminal status prevents them from claiming moral high ground. This psychological complexity makes the horror more disturbing than simple violence would be, as it forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions about justice and morality. The story's conclusion provides resolution to the immediate physical conflict, while leaving the deeper moral questions unresolved. Rocky's escape and Norman's survival mean that the cycle of violence and injustice The failure of the legal system to address the crimes committed by any of the characters suggests that individual action, however morally questionable, may be the only way to achieve any form of justice in a broken system. The film serves as a commentary on American society's treatment of both veterans and the economically disadvantaged, showing how institutional failures create the conditions for individual tragedy. Norman's transformation from hero to criminal reflects society's abandonment of veterans dealing with trauma, while the young criminal's desperation reflects the lack of legitimate opportunities for advancement in economically devastated communities. The collision of these social problems creates the violence that destroys lives and perpetuates cycles of harm. The story's ending, with Rocky boarding a train to California with the stolen money, provides a form of resolution that satisfies genre expectations while raising troubling questions about justice and morality. Her escape represents the achievement of her goals, but the price paid in human lives and moral compromise casts doubt on whether her victory is worth celebrating. The audience is left to decide whether her survival and freedom justify the crimes she committed and witnessed in Norman's house. The film's exploration of sensory experience, particularly the way Norman navigates his world through sound and touch, provides insight into disability while serving the story's thriller elements. The scenes where characters move through darkness rely heavily on audio cues to create tension and convey spatial relationships, putting the audience in a similar position to Norman, and demonstrating how non-visual senses can provide detailed information about environment and threats. The story ultimately presents a world where traditional moral categories have broken down under the pressure of economic desperation and institutional failure. In this environment, every character makes choices that can be simultaneously understood and condemned, while the pursuit of individual goals creates conflicts that destroy lives and perpetuate injustice. The film's power lies in its refusal to provide easy answers to difficult questions, forcing viewers to confront the complexity of real-world moral situations, where heroes and villains are not clearly defined. The film's visual storytelling employs darkness as both literal and metaphorical element, with the absence of light serving multiple narrative functions throughout the story. The opening sequences establish the abandoned Detroit neighborhood through stark imagery that emphasizes isolation and decay, while the interior scenes in Norman's house use shadows and confined spaces to create claustrophobia and tension. The cinematography makes deliberate choices about what to show and what to conceal, mirroring Norman's own relationship with sight and blindness, while building suspense through selective revelation of information. The sound design becomes a crucial element in creating the film's atmosphere and building tension, with every creak, footstep, and breath carrying significance in the story's logic. Norman's heightened auditory awareness is reflected in the film's attention to ambient sounds that might go unnoticed in other contexts, while the absence of sound becomes equally important in moments where characters attempt to move silently. The careful layering of audio elements creates an immersive experience that puts viewers in Norman's position of navigating the world through non-visual senses. The production design of Norman's house reflects both his disability adaptations and his criminal activities, with each room serving multiple functions in the story's development. The main floor appears to be a typical modest home with accommodations for a blind resident, but the basement reveals a completely different reality that transforms audience understanding of the character and situation. The contrast between the normal-appearing upper floors and the prison-like basement creates a powerful visual metaphor for Norman's dual nature as both victim and perpetrator. The film's editing creates pacing that builds tension through a combination of fast cuts during action sequences and longer takes that allow suspense to develop naturally. The rhythm of the editing reflects the character's psychological states, with frantic cutting during chase scenes contrasting with slower, more deliberate pacing during moments of discovery and revelation. The transitions between scenes often use sound bridges that maintain continuity while shifting locations, reinforcing the importance of audio in the story's logic. The casting choices bring together actors who can convey both vulnerability and menace, with each performer required to shift between sympathetic and threatening characteristics as the story reveals new information about their characters. The physical performances become particularly important in scenes where dialogue is minimal, with body language and facial expressions carrying much of the emotional weight. The actors must convincingly portray characters whose moral status changes throughout the film, requiring nuanced performances that avoid simple characterization. The screenplay's structure follows a three-act format that uses the home invasion setup as a launching point for deeper exploration of character and theme. The first act establishes the characters and their motivations while building toward the break-in. The second act reveals the true nature of the situation and escalates the conflict, and the third act provides resolution while leaving key moral questions unanswered. The script's dialogue serves multiple functions, revealing character while advancing plot and providing exposition without feeling forced or unnatural. The film's exploration of violence examines both its causes and consequences, showing how different characters resort to brutality for different reasons while paying different prices for their actions. Norman's violence stems from grief and a desire for justice that has become corrupted into something more sinister, while the intruder's violence is initially defensive but becomes increasingly desperate as their situation deteriorates. The story avoids glorifying violence while acknowledging its reality in situations where legal and social systems have failed to provide adequate protection or justice. The themes of family and parenthood run throughout the story, with multiple characters motivated by relationships with children and the desire to protect or create family bonds. Rocky's devotion to her sister drives her criminal activity, while Norman's grief over his daughter's death motivates his crimes and his twisted attempt to replace her. The film explores how love for family members can justify terrible actions, while showing the destructive potential of relationships based on control rather than genuine care. The movie's treatment of disability challenges stereotypes while avoiding the opposite extreme of presenting disability as a superpower. Norman's blindness is shown as a genuine limitation that he has learned to work around through adaptation and training, rather than something that has given him supernatural abilities. His advantages in the dark house come from preparation and familiarity rather than enhanced senses, while his disadvantages in other situations remain real. The film's social commentary extends beyond individual character studies to examine broader issues of urban decay, veteran support, and economic inequality. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods serve as both setting and symbol for the failure of American institutions to address the needs of their citizens, while the characters' criminal activities reflect the desperation created by lack of legitimate opportunity. The story suggests that crime is often a symptom of deeper social problems rather than simply individual moral failure. The movie's horror elements derive more from psychological tension and moral ambiguity than from graphic violence or supernatural scares. The discovery of Norman's basement prison creates genuine horror through the implications of what has happened there. While the chase sequences build tension, the film's most disturbing moments come from the realization of what the characters are capable of doing to each other, rather than from explicit depictions of violence. The cinematography employs a variety of techniques to create visual interest and support the story's themes, including handheld camera work that creates intimacy and immediacy during tense sequences, and more stable shots that emphasize the house's architecture and spatial relevance. The use of close-ups and extreme close-ups brings viewers uncomfortably close to the characters during moments of high emotion, while wide shots establish the isolation and abandonment of the setting. The film's color palette emphasizes muted tones and shadows that reflect the moral ambiguity of the situation and the economic desperation of the characters' circumstances. The lighting design creates stark contrasts between illuminated and dark areas, supporting both the practical needs of the story and its thematic concerns with hidden truths and moral blindness. The visual choices consistently support the narrative while creating a distinctive aesthetic that enhances the viewing experience. The story's pacing builds momentum through a series of escalating revelations and reversals that continually shift audience understanding. Each new discovery about the characters or their situation changes the moral calculation, while the physical action maintains forward drive toward the inevitable confrontation. The film avoids the common horror movie mistake of having characters make inexplicably stupid decisions, instead showing how reasonable choices can lead to terrible consequences. The movie's examination of justice explores both legal and personal concepts of fairness, showing how the failure of official systems leads individuals to take matters into their own hands with tragic results. Norman's vigilante justice against his daughter's killer reflects broader public frustration with perceived inadequacies in the legal system, while The Intruder's criminal activities represent another form of self-help in the absence of legitimate economic opportunities. Neither approach achieves satisfactory results, suggesting the need for better institutional responses to social problems. The film's treatment of trauma shows how different people respond to devastating experiences in different ways, with some becoming withdrawn and others becoming aggressive or criminal. Norman's response to losing his daughter involves elaborate planning and criminal activity, while Rocky's response to her family situation drives her toward crime as an escape route. The story avoids simple explanations for complex behaviors, while showing how trauma can perpetuate cycles of violence and harm. The movie's exploration of home and territory examines how people create safe spaces and defend them against perceived threats. Norman's house represents both refuge and fortress, adapted to his needs, while serving his criminal purposes, while the intruders violate his space without understanding the full implications of their action. The story shows how the concept of home can become corrupted when it is used to conceal terrible secrets or criminal activities. The film's dialogue serves multiple functions beyond simple exposition, revealing character traits and relationships while building tension and advancing the plot. The conversations between the young criminals establish their personalities and motivations while showing the dynamics of their relationships. While Norman's limited dialogue, the screenplay uses silence as effectively as speech, with many of the most powerful moments occurring without words. The movie's production values support its themes and story through careful attention to detail in all aspects of filmmaking. The production design creates believable environments that serve both practical and symbolic functions, while the costume design reflects character status and personality without calling attention to itself. The makeup and special effects support the story's violence without becoming excessive or exploitative. The film's editing creates rhythm and pacing that serves the story's emotional arc while maintaining clarity during complex action sequences. The cuts between different perspectives and locations help build tension while providing necessary information about character positions and tactical situations. The post-production work integrates all elements seamlessly to create a cohesive viewing experience that supports the story's themes and emotional impact. The movie's sound mixing creates an immersive audio environment that reflects Norman's heightened awareness of non-visual information while building suspense for the audience. The careful balance between dialogue, sound effects, and music creates layers of meaning that support the story without over. The use of silence becomes as important as sound in creating moments of tension and release. The film's musical score provides emotional support for key scenes while avoiding the trap of telegraphing plot developments or manipulating audience emotions too obviously. The music serves to enhance rather than replace the emotional content of the performances and story, with careful use of leitmotifs and thematic material that reinforces character development and story structure. The integration of music with sound effects creates a unified audio landscape that serves the story's needs. The movie's visual effects support the story's needs. The movie's visual effects support the story without calling attention to. The digital work seamlessly integrates with practical locations and props to create a convincing world for the story to unfold within. The restraint shown in the use of effects reflects the film's focus on character and story over spectacle. The film's marketing and promotion reflect its position as a mid-budget thriller that relies on word of mouth and critical reception rather than massive advertising campaigns. The promotional materials emphasize the film's suspense and moral complexity without revealing key plot points that would spoil the viewing experience. The marketing strategy recognizes that the film's strengths lie in its story and characters rather than in spectacular action or star power. The movie's reception among critics and audiences reflects its success in creating a compelling story that operates on multiple levels while avoiding. The film's ability to generate discussion about its moral themes while delivering effective thrills demonstrates the potential for horror and thriller genres to address serious social issues. The positive response to the film's complexity suggests audience appetite for entertainment that challenges as well as entertains. The film's influence on subsequent horror and thriller productions can be seen in increased attention to character development and moral ambiguity in genre films. The movie's success in combining social commentary with effective suspense has encouraged other filmmakers to attempt similar balancing acts between entertainment and meaningful content. The film's technical achievements in creating tension through sound and visual design have also influenced industry practices. The movie's place in the broader horror genre reflects its contribution to the evolution of the home invasion subgenre, moving beyond simple victim and perpetrator dynamics to explore more complex moral territories. The film's examination of disability, trauma, and economic desperation adds depth to familiar genre conventions while maintaining the fundamental appeal. Its success demonstrates the continuing viability of mid-budget genre filmmaking in an industry increasingly focused on large-scale productions. The film's cultural impact extends beyond its immediate genre to contribute to broader discussions about urban decay, veteran support, and criminal justice. The movie's portrayal of Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods brings attention to the real-world problems of post-industrial cities, while its examination of veteran trauma highlights ongoing social issues. The film's complex moral landscape encourages viewers to think critically about justice, revenge, and the factors that drive criminal behavior. The movie's technical achievements in creating suspense through practical means, rather than relying heavily on special effects, demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional filmmaking techniques. The film's use of location, lighting, sound, and performance to create fear and tension shows how effective horror can be created through craftsmanship and creativity rather than budget and technology. These achievements provide lessons for aspiring filmmakers working with limited resources. The film's exploration of American social issues through the lens of genre entertainment reflects a tradition of American social issues through the lens of genre entertainment reflects a tradition. The movie's treatment of economic inequality, institutional failure, and individual responses to trauma connects it to broader patterns in American cinema while maintaining its identity as effective entertainment. The film's ability to address serious issues without becoming preachy or didactic demonstrates the potential for genre films to contribute to social discourse. The movie's ending provides narrative closure while leaving thematic questions open for audience consideration, reflecting sophisticated understanding of how to satisfy genre expectations while encouraging deeper thought. The resolution of the immediate physical conflict contrasts with the unresolved moral and social issues that created the situation, suggesting that individual stories exist within broader contexts that require systemic rather than personal solutions. The film's legacy in horror cinema includes its contribution to discussions about moral complexity in genre storytelling and its demonstration of how traditional suspense techniques remain effective in contemporary filmmaking. The movie's influence can be seen in subsequent films that attempt to balance entertainment value with social commentary, while its technical achievements continue to be studied and emulated. The film's success proves that audiences respond to intelligent genre filmmaking that respects their ability to engage with difficult moral questions while delivering effective scares and thrills. The thematic depth of Don't Breathe extends far beyond its surface-level thriller elements to explore fundamental questions about justice, victimhood, and moral authority in contemporary American society. The film operates as a meditation on how institutional failures create the conditions for individual acts of violence and revenge, while simultaneously examining the ways in which society determines who deserves sympathy and protection. The story's moral complexity arises from its refusal to provide clear heroes and villains, instead presenting characters whose actions can be simultaneously understood and condemned based on their circumstances. The film's treatment of economic inequality serves as both backdrop and driving force for the central conflict, with Detroit's post-industrial decline creating the conditions that drive the young criminals to increasingly desperate measures. The abandoned neighborhoods that surround Norman's house represent more than just atmospheric setting. They symbolize the failure of American economic and social systems to provide adequate opportunities for advancement or security. The contrast between the wealthy Roberts family's ability to buy their daughter's freedom and the desperate circumstances that drive Rocky, Alex, and Money to crime illustrates the ways in which economic privilege shapes access to justice and opportunity. Norman's character represents the intersection of multiple forms of social abandonment, combining veteran neglect with disability discrimination and the failure of the justice system to provide adequate remedies for personal. His transformation from sympathetic victim to dangerous predator illustrates how trauma and institutional betrayal can corrupt even those who have served their country with honor. The film suggests that his crimes, while inexcusable, grow out of a system that failed to provide him with adequate support after his military service or appropriate justice after his daughter's death. The movie's exploration of disability challenges common assumptions about vulnerability and strength, while avoiding the equally problematic tendency to romanticize disability as a form of compensation for other limitations. Norman's blindness is presented as a genuine disability that affects his daily life and capabilities, but his adaptation to this limitation through training and environmental modification gives him significant advantages in his own. The film avoids both the stereotype of the helpless disabled person and the opposite extreme of the disabled person with supernatural abilities, instead presenting a realistic portrayal of how someone might adapt to significant sensory loss. The story's examination of home invasion thriller conventions reveals how genre expectations shape audience sympathy and moral judgment. The traditional setup encourages viewers to identify with the intruders despite their criminal intentions, while the revelation of Norman's crimes forces a re-evaluation of these sympathies. This manipulation of genre expectations serves the film's broader themes about the complexity of moral judgment and the danger of making assumptions based on appearances or initial impressions. The film's visual language consistently reinforces its themes through careful attention to imagery and symbolism that supports the story's exploration of imprisonment, both literal and metaphorical. The bars on windows, the confined spaces of the house, and the basement prison all serve as physical manifestations of the various forms of imprisonment that affect all the characters. Rocky is imprisoned by her economic circumstances and family situation. Norman is imprisoned by his grief and disability, and all of them become literally imprisoned within the house during the central conflict. The movie's sound design creates an auditory landscape that reflects Norman's experience of the world, while building tension for the audience through careful attention to ambient noise and silence. Every sound carries significance in Norman's world, from the creak of floorboards that reveals an intruder's location to the subtle changes in air movement that indicates someone's presence. The film's use of silence becomes equally important, with moments of complete quiet creating tension, while characters attempt to move undetected through an environment where every noise might mean discovery and death. The story's pacing builds momentum through a careful balance of revelation and action that maintains audience engagement while developing complex themes. The first act establishes the characters and their motivations while building toward the break-in, creating sympathy for the criminals while establishing Norman as a potential victim. The second act systematically dismantles these assumptions through a series of discoveries that reveal the true nature of the situation, while the third act provides resolution to the immediate conflict while leaving broader questions about justice and morality unresolved. The film's casting choices support its thematic concerns through performances that convey both vulnerability and menace in different characters at different times. Jane Levy's portrayal of Rocky must shift from criminal to victim, while maintaining audience sympathy throughout her moral journey. Stephen Lang's performance as Norman requires him to embody both the tragic figure of a grieving father and disabled veteran and the terrifying presence of a violent predator. The supporting cast must similarly navigate complex characterizations that avoid simple. The movie's production design creates environments that serve both practical and symbolic functions in the story's development. Norman's house appears normal on the surface, but contains hidden horrors that reflect his psychological state, while the abandoned Detroit neighborhood provides context for the economic desperation that drives to increasingly dangerous risks. Every element of the design supports the story themes while creating believable spaces for the action to unfold. The film's editing creates rhythm and pacing that serves the story's emotional arc, while maintaining clarity during complex sequences involving multiple characters moving through a confined space. The cuts between different perspectives help build tension while providing necessary information about spatial relationships and tactical situations. The post-production work integrates all elements to create a cohesive experience that supports the The movie's exploration of family relationships reveals how love and protection can motivate both criminal behavior and violent revenge. Rocky's devotion to her sister drives her participation in increasingly dangerous crimes, while Norman's grief over his daughter's death motivates his elaborate scheme for replacement and revenge. The film shows how genuine love can become corrupted when it encounters systems that fail to provide adequate protection or justice for vulnerable family members. The story's treatment of mental health issues, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, avoids simple explanations while acknowledging the reality of how combat trauma can affect veterans long after their service ends. Norman's isolation and paranoid behavior suggest ongoing psychological damage from his military experience, while his elaborate planning and criminal activities indicate a level of dysfunction that goes beyond normal grief or adjustment to disability. The film suggests that adequate mental health support might have prevented his transformation into a criminal. The movie's examination of sexual violence adds another layer of moral complexity to the story, with Norman's plans for forced pregnancy representing perhaps the most disturbing element of his criminal behavior. This aspect of his crimes transforms him definitively from victim to perpetrator while highlighting the gendered nature of much sexual violence. The film handles this material with appropriate seriousness while using it to illustrate the complete corruption of Norman's quest for justice. The film's exploration of urban decay reflects broader patterns of American economic development that have left entire cities struggling with abandonment and decline. Detroit serves as a particularly potent symbol of these trends, with its history of industrial prosperity followed by economic collapse, creating the conditions that drive much of the story's conflict. The abandoned neighborhoods represent not just individual tragedy, but systemic failure that affects entire communities. The movie's treatment of class conflict reveals how economic inequality shapes access to justice and opportunity in fundamental ways. The wealthy Roberts family's ability to shield their daughter from consequences for her actions contrasts sharply with the desperate circumstances that drive the young criminals to increasingly dangerous behavior. Norman's cash settlement represents money that should provide justice, but instead becomes the object of criminal desire, showing how even legal remedies can fail to address underlying inequality. The story's examination of vigilante justice explores the appeal and danger of taking the law into one's own hands when institutional systems fail to provide adequate remedies. Norman's elaborate scheme to replace his daughter through forced pregnancy represents an extreme form of self-help justice that has become completely divorced from any reasonable understanding of fairness or proportionality. The film suggests that while the impulse toward personal justice may be understandable, the results are inevitably destructive. The film's visual style employs darkness and shadow to create both practical advantages for Norman and symbolic representation of the moral ambiguity that pervades the story. The scenes in the darkened house put the audience in a similar position to the cited characters, struggling to understand what is happening while Norman moves with confidence through familiar territory. This visual approach reinforces the theme that appearances can be deceiving and that knowledge and power can shift based on circumstances. The movie's exploration of surveillance and security reflects contemporary concerns about privacy and protection in an increasingly dangerous world. Alex's access to security codes through his father's business provides the technical means for their crimes, while Norman's adaptation of his home for defensive purposes shows how ordinary people attempt to protect themselves from threats. The film suggests that security measures can become prisons for those they are meant to protect. The story's treatment of addiction and family dysfunction provides context for Rocky's criminal behavior, while avoiding simple excuses for her choices. Her mother's alcoholism and neglect create an environment where crime seems like the only viable escape route, while her relationship with her sister provides the emotional motivation that drives her to take increasingly dangerous risks. The film shows how family problems can perpetuate cycles of dysfunction. The movie's examination of friendship and loyalty reveals how criminal enterprises can create bonds that survive even extreme stress and moral compromise. The relationship between Rocky, Alex, and Money shows different approaches to criminal behavior, from Money's aggressive opportunism to Alex's reluctant participation, driven by his feelings for Rocky. The film's treatment of gender roles and expectations adds another dimension to its exploration of power and vulnerability. Rocky's gender makes her appear less threatening to potential victims while also making her vulnerable to sexual violence from Norman. The contrast between her tough exterior and genuine vulnerability reflects broader social patterns about how women navigate dangerous situations and criminal environments. The movie's exploration of technology and accessibility shows how devices designed to help disabled people can also serve criminal purposes when used by someone with Norman's tactical knowledge and criminal intent. His familiarity with his home's layout and security systems gives him advantages that his disability might otherwise negate, while the intruder's reliance on conventional criminal techniques proves inadequate against his unconventional defense. The story's examination of media representation and public perception reveals how narratives can be shaped to serve particular interests or preconceptions. The news coverage of the incident presents Norman as a heroic disabled veteran, defending his home against criminal intruders, completely ignoring the more complex reality of what actually occurred. This simplified narrative serves everyone's interests except those of the actual victims, showing how institutional power shapes public understanding of events. The film's treatment of religious and spiritual themes appears primarily through Norman's apparent belief that his actions serve some higher purpose of justice or divine will. His conviction that Cindy owes him a replacement child suggests a worldview where personal tragedy justifies extreme measures to restore what has been lost. The film neither endorses nor completely dismisses these beliefs, instead presenting them as another factor in the complex moral landscape that drives the story. The movie's exploration of legacy and memory examines how people attempt to preserve or replace what they have lost through violence and control. Norman's quest to replace his daughter represents an extreme form of this impulse, while Rocky's efforts to escape her circumstances show a different approach to breaking cycles of dysfunction and creating better futures. The film suggests that healthy responses to loss involve acceptance and growth, rather than attempts to recreate what cannot be recovered. The story's treatment of community and isolation reveals how social breakdown creates conditions where extreme behavior can flourish without intervention or consequence. Norman's isolation in his abandoned neighborhood allows his crimes to continue undetected, while the breakdown of traditional community structures leaves vulnerable people like Rocky with few legitimate options for improving their circumstances. The movie's examination of law enforcement and criminal justice shows how these systems can fail both victims and perpetrators in different ways. The film suggests that effective justice requires understanding complex situations rather than simply applying rules to isolated incidents. The philosophical underpinnings of Don't Breathe extend into existential territory, questioning the very nature of morality when societal structures fail to provide adequate frameworks for justice and protection. The film presents a world where traditional moral categories have broken down under the pressure of institutional failure, economic desperation, and personal trauma. In this environment, characters are forced to create their own systems of justice and survival, leading to conflicts that reveal the arbitrary nature of many moral distinctions and the difficulty of maintaining ethical behavior in extreme circumstances. The movie's treatment of perspective and point of view becomes crucial to its exploration of moral ambiguity, with the audience's sympathies shifting based on which character's experience is foregrounded at any given moment. The opening sequences establish Rocky's desperate circumstances and her love for her sister, creating initial sympathy for her criminal activities. The revelation of Norman's grief and victimization complicates these sympathies, while the discovery of his crimes against Cindy transforms him definitively into a villain. This manipulation of audience perspective serves the film's broader themes about the subjectivity of moral judgment and the danger of making assumptions based on limited information. The film's exploration of sensory experience extends beyond Norman's blindness to examine how all the characters navigate their environment through different combinations of senses and intuition. The scenes in the darkened house force the audience to rely on audio cues to understand spatial relationships and character positions, creating a shared experience with the sighted characters who find themselves effectively blind. This emphasis on non-visual information serves both practical storytelling purposes and thematic concerns about different ways of understanding and interpreting reality. The movie's treatment of institutional failure reveals how the breakdown of social systems creates conditions where extreme individual responses become seemingly rational choices. Norman's transformation into a criminal represents one response to the failure of both the military system that damaged him and the justice system that failed to adequately punish his daughter's killer. The young criminal's activities represent another response to economic systems that have failed to provide legitimate opportunities for advancement. The film suggests that institutional reform might prevent much individual. The story's examination of communication and dialogue reveals how characters use language both to reveal and conceal their true intentions and feelings. Norman's limited dialogue during the invasion scenes reflects his tactical approach to the situation, while his more extensive conversations with Rocky during her captivity reveal his psychological state and warped worldview. The criminals' conversations establish their relationships and motivations while showing how they justify their actions to themselves and each other. The film's use of silence becomes equally important, with many crucial moments occurring without dialogue. The movie's exploration of space and territory examines how people create and defend their personal domains against perceived threats. Norman's house represents both refuge and fortress, adapted to his needs while serving his criminal purposes. The abandoned neighborhood provides context for his isolation, while creating an environment where criminal activities can occur without detection. The contrast between public and private spaces reveals different rules and expectations that govern behavior in different contexts. The film's treatment of violence examines both its immediate physical effects and its longer-term psychological consequences for all parties involved. The deaths in the story are not glorified or presented as entertainment, but shown as tragic outcomes of conflicts that might have been resolved through other means. The violence escalates gradually as characters become more desperate and their options become more limited, suggesting that much violence stems from circumstances rather than inherent evil or aggression. The movie's exploration of gender dynamics adds complexity to its examination of power and vulnerability, with Rocky's status as a young woman affecting how other characters respond to her, while also influencing her own strategic choices. Her relationship with Alex shows how gender expectations can both protect and endanger women in criminal contexts, while Norman's sexual violence against Cindy and his plans for Rocky reveal how gender-based violence often represents attempts to exert control rather than expressions of sexual desire. The story's treatment of aging and generational conflict reveals different approaches to dealing with life's challenges and disappointment. Norman represents an older generation that has been abandoned by the institutions it served, while the young criminals represent a generation that has never had faith in those institutions. Their conflict reflects broader social tensions between different generational approaches to authority, justice, and survival in difficult circumstances. The film's examination of loyalty and betrayal shows how extreme circumstances can both strengthen and destroy relationships between people who depend on each other for survival. The bonds between the three criminals are tested by the dangerous situation they encounter, with Alex's sacrifice for Rocky representing the triumph of love over self-preservation, while Money's aggressive behavior creates additional dangers for his companion. Norman's isolation reflects the absence of such relationships in his life, and perhaps contributes to his criminal behavior. The movie's treatment of redemption and forgiveness explores whether people who have committed terrible acts can ever truly atone for their crimes or deserve sympathy for their suffering. Norman's status as both victim and perpetrator creates complex questions about how society should respond to individuals who have been damaged by their experiences, while also causing harm to others. The film avoids easy answers while acknowledging the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The story's exploration of identity and self-perception reveals how characters understand themselves and their actions. Rocky sees herself as a protector trying to save her sister from a destructive environment, while Norman views his crimes as justified responses to the injustices he has suffered. These self-perceptions influence their choices while potentially blinding them to the harm they cause others. The film's treatment of mental health and psychological trauma avoids simple explanations while acknowledging the reality of how extreme experiences can permanently alter people's behavior and worldview. Norman's elaborate criminal schemes suggest a level of psychological dysfunction that goes beyond normal grief or adjustment to disability. while Rocky's criminal activities may represent maladaptive responses to family trauma and economic stress. The story suggests that adequate mental health support might prevent much criminal behavior. The movie's examination of surveillance and privacy reflects contemporary concerns about security and protection in an increasingly dangerous world. Alex's access to security codes provides the technical means for their crimes, while Norman's adaptation of his home for defensive purposes shows how ordinary people attempt to protect themselves from various threats. The film suggests that security measures can become prisons for those they are meant to protect while failing to address underlying causes of danger. The story's treatment of media representation and narrative control shows how public understanding of events can be shaped by those who have the power to tell the story. The news coverage of the incident presents a simplified version of events that serves certain interests while ignoring crucial information about what actually occurred. This manipulation of information reflects broader patterns of how power shapes public discourse and understanding of complex social issues. The film's exploration of economic systems and their human costs reveals how financial pressures create conditions that drive much criminal behavior and social conflict. The contrast between the wealthy Roberts family's ability to buy immunity for their daughter and the desperate circumstances that drive the young criminals to increasingly dangerous behavior illustrates fundamental inequalities that shape access to justice and opportunity. Norman's cash settlement represents money that should provide security, but instead becomes the object of criminal desire. The movie's treatment of disability rights and representation raises important questions about how physically disabled people are portrayed in popular culture, and how society understands the relationship between disability and vulnerability. Norman's character challenges stereotypes about helpless disabled people while avoiding the opposite extreme of presenting disability as a form of compensation or superpower. His blindness affects his capabilities, but does not define his moral character, which is shaped by his choices rather than his physical condition. The story's examination of community and social isolation reveals how the breakdown of traditional social structures creates conditions where extreme behavior can flourish without intervention or consequence. Norman's isolation in his abandoned neighborhood allows his crimes to continue undetected, while the lack of strong community connections leaves vulnerable people like Rocky with few legitimate options for improving their circumstances. The film suggests that stronger communities might prevent both criminal behavior and vigilante justice. The film's treatment of justice and punishment explores both legal and moral concepts of appropriate responses to harmful behavior. The inadequate punishment for Cindy's killing of Norman's daughter creates conditions for his vigilante justice, while the police response to the home invasion focuses on immediate criminal acts rather than broader patterns of crime and victimization. The story suggests that effective justice requires understanding complex situations rather than simply applying rules to isolated incidents. The movie's exploration of hope and despair examines how people respond to seemingly impossible circumstances and maintain motivation in the face of overwhelming challenges. Rocky's determination to create a better life for her sister provides emotional anchor for her criminal activities, while Norman's grief and isolation drive him toward increasingly destructive behavior. The contrast between their responses to trauma suggests that connection to others and hope for the future may be crucial factors in determining whether people respond to difficulty through constructive or destructive means. The story's treatment of sacrifice and selflessness reveals different motivations for putting others' welfare above one's own survival and comfort. Alex's ultimate sacrifice for Rocky demonstrates genuine love that transcends self-interest, while Rocky's criminal activities are motivated by her desire to protect her sister rather than personal gain. Norman's crimes, by contrast, are entirely self-serving despite his attempts to justify them as responses to injustice, showing the difference between genuine sacrifice and selfish behavior disguised as The film's examination of moral education and development explores how people learn to distinguish between right and wrong behavior and what factors influence these crucial life skills. The young criminals have apparently received little guidance about ethical behavior, while Norman's military service should have provided moral structure, but may have been compromised by combat trauma. The story suggests that moral development requires both education and supportive community structures that help people navigate difficult situations without resorting to destructive behavior. The film's complex moral framework becomes even more apparent when examining how it challenges traditional notions of heroism and villainy within the horror genre frame. Unlike conventional horror films that present clear distinctions between innocent victims and monstrous antagonists, Don't Breathe deliberately blurs these lines to create a more unsettling and thought-provoking viewing experience. The story forces audiences to confront their own moral assumptions and biases while questioning the societal factors that shape our understanding of right and wrong behavior. The character development throughout the film demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the ways in which extreme circumstances can reveal hidden aspects of personality that might otherwise remain dormant. Rocky's transformation from petty criminal to determined survivor shows her capacity for both selfishness and heroism, while Norman's evolution from sympathetic victim to terrifying predator illustrates how trauma and these character arcs avoid simple moral judgments while providing insight into the complex factors that influence human behavior. The film's treatment of social class and economic inequality extends beyond simple poverty to examine how systemic disadvantages create conditions that perpetuate cycles of crime and violence across generations. Rocky's family situation reflects broader patterns of dysfunction that affect entire communities, while Norman's isolation demonstrates how even those who receive financial compensation for their losses can remain fundamentally abandoned by the social systems they trusted. The story suggests that meaningful solutions to crime and violence require addressing underlying economic and social inequalities rather than simply punishing individual perpetrators. The movie's exploration of military service and veteran affairs provides commentary on how society treats those who have sacrificed for their country, particularly when they return home with disabilities or psychological trauma. Norman's blindness and apparent post-traumatic stress disorder represent injuries that should entitle him to support and care from the society he served. But his isolation and criminal behavior suggest that such support has been inadequate or absent, and the film raises questions about moral responsibility when institutions fail those who have given the most for their communities. The story's examination of family structures and protective relationships reveals how love and loyalty can motivate both criminal behavior and acts of heroism, depending on the circumstances and choices involved. Rocky's devotion to her sister drives her participation in increasingly dangerous crimes, while Alex's feelings for Rocky motivate him to acts of courage that ultimately cost him his life. Norman's grief over his daughter's death motivates his elaborate scheme for replacement and revenge, showing how the same emotional bond that creates love can also generate destructive obsession. The film's visual storytelling employs architectural and spatial elements to reinforce themes about imprisonment, isolation, and the ways in which physical environments reflect psychological states. Norman's house serves as both sanctuary and prison, adapted to his needs while concealing his crimes from the outside world. The abandoned neighborhood surrounding his home provides context for his isolation, while creating an environment where criminal activities can occur without detection or intervention from authorities or neighbors. The movie's sound design creates an immersive auditory landscape that reflects Norman's heightened awareness of non-visual information, while building tension for viewers through careful attention to ambient noise and strategic use of sound. Every creak, breath, and footstep carries significance in Norman's world, while the absence of sound becomes equally important when characters attempt to move undetected through an environment where the slightest noise might reveal their location and intentions. The story's pacing builds momentum through a careful balance of character development, plot revelation, and physical action that maintains audience engagement while developing complex themes about justice, survival, and moral responsibility. The first act establishes sympathetic motivations for the criminals while presenting Norman as a potential victim. The second act systematically undermines these assumptions through revelations about his true nature. And the third act provides resolution to immediate conflicts while leaving broader moral questions unresolved. The film's casting choices support its thematic concerns through performances that convey both vulnerability and menace in different characters at different times. Each actor must navigate complex characterizations that avoid simple moral categories while maintaining audience engagement with characters whose actions become increasingly difficult to justify or condemn based on traditional moral frameworks. The movie's production design creates environments that serve both practical storytelling needs and symbolic functions in exploring themes about adaptation, survival, and the ways in which people modify their surroundings to serve their psychological and physical needs. Norman's adaptations for his blindness also serve his defensive and criminal purposes, while the contrast between the apparently normal upper floors and the prison-like basement reflects his dual nature as both victim and perpetrator. The story's treatment of sexual violence adds another layer of moral complexity that transforms Norman definitively from potential victim to clear antagonist, while raising questions about how trauma and injustice can corrupt. His plans for forced pregnancy represent perhaps the most disturbing element of his criminal behavior, showing how his quest for replacement has become completely divorced from any reasonable understanding of justice or fairness. The film's exploration of disability representation challenges common stereotypes about helpless, disabled people, while avoiding the equally problematic tendency to present disability as compensation for other limitations or Norman's blindness affects his capabilities in realistic ways, while his adaptation and training give him advantages in familiar environments, creating a nuanced portrayal that respects both the reality of disability and the potential for adaptation and empowerment. The movie's examination of urban decay and post-industrial decline provides context for the character's actions while serving as a metaphor for broader social breakdown that creates conditions where extreme behavior can flourish without adequate intervention or support from institutional systems. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods represent more than atmospheric setting. They symbolize the failure of American economic and social systems to provide security and opportunity. The story's treatment of justice systems and legal processes reveals how institutional failures can create conditions that drive individuals toward vigilante behavior or criminal activity when official channels prove inadequate for addressing their needs or grievances. Norman's transformation into a criminal represents one response to legal system failure. The film's exploration of communication and language reveals how characters use speech both to reveal and conceal their true intentions, while building relationships or establishing dominance in dangerous situations. The limited dialogue during action sequences forces attention to nonverbal communication and environmental cues, while longer conversations reveal character, psychology, and motivation in ways that advance both plot and them development. The movie's treatment of surveillance and security technology reflects contemporary concerns about privacy and protection, while showing how devices designed to help or protect people can also serve criminal purposes when used by those with tactical knowledge and criminal intent. The security systems that should protect potential victims instead become tools for criminal activity, while defensive measures can become prisons for those they are meant. The story's examination of grief and loss explores different ways people respond to devastating experiences, while showing how the same emotional trauma can generate both sympathy-worthy responses and completely destructive behavior. Norman's grief over his daughter's death creates understanding for his pain, while his criminal response to that grief transforms him into someone who perpetuates the cycle of trauma and loss that damaged him originally. The film's treatment of economic systems and financial pressure reveals how monetary concerns drive much criminal behavior and social conflict, while showing how even legitimate financial remedies can become objects of criminal desire rather than sources of security and healing. The cash settlement that should provide Norman with security instead becomes the target of criminal activity, while the criminal's desperate need for money. The movie's exploration of moral education and ethical development examines how people learn to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, while questioning what factors influence these crucial life skills when institutional guidance proves inadequate or absent. The character's various moral failures suggest that effective ethical development requires both education and supportive community structures that help people navigate difficult situations. The story's treatment of redemption and second chances raises questions about whether people who have committed terrible acts can ever truly atone for their crimes while deserving sympathy for their own suffering and traumatic experiences. The film avoids easy answers while acknowledging the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, suggesting that understanding complex motivations does not necessarily excuse harmful behavior, but may be necessary. The film's ending provides narrative closure while leaving thematic questions deliberately unresolved, reflecting sophisticated understanding of how to satisfy genre expectations while encouraging continued reflection on difficult moral and social issues. The movie's contribution to horror cinema includes its demonstration that effective suspense and fear can be created through psychological complexity and moral ambiguity, rather than relying primarily on graphic violence or supernatural scares. The film's most disturbing elements come from the realization of what humans are capable of doing to each other under extreme circumstances, rather than from explicit depictions. The story's cultural impact extends beyond entertainment to contribute to ongoing discussions about veteran support, urban decay, criminal justice reform, and the social factors that drive individual acts of violence and crime. The film's complex portrayal of disability, trauma, and economic desperation adds depth to public discourse, while avoiding simple solutions or easy moral judgments that might reduce complex. The film's sophisticated manipulation of audience sympathies serves as a masterclass in how genre conventions can be subverted to create deeper engagement with complex moral questions. The opening sequences establish Rocky as a sympathetic figure through her devotion to her sister and her desire to escape an abusive home environment, while simultaneously showing her participation in criminal activities that would normally make audiences view her as a villain. This deliberate contradiction forces viewers to engage with the story on a more nuanced level than typical thriller narratives allow. The movie's treatment of institutional abandonment becomes particularly relevant when examining how various systems have failed each of the main characters in different ways. The criminal justice system failed Norman by providing inadequate punishment for his daughter's killer, while the military system that he served appears to have abandoned him after his combat injuries left him disabled and traumatized. The economic system has failed Rocky and her companions by providing no legitimate path to the security and opportunities they desperately need, while the social service system has apparently failed to protect Rocky's sister from an abusive home environment. The story's exploration of moral relativism challenges absolute notions of right and wrong behavior by showing how circumstances and perspective can dramatically alter ethical calculation. Norman's crimes against Cindy Roberts are clearly inexcusable from an objective moral standpoint, yet his grief and the inadequate justice he received for his daughter's death provide context that complicates simple moral judgments. Similarly, the young criminal's invasion of his home represents a clear violation of his rights and privacy, yet their desperate circumstances and his hidden crimes create moral ambiguity that defies easy resolution. The film's treatment of visual impairment and sensory experience extends beyond Norman's blindness to examine how all characters navigate their environment through different combinations of perception, intuition, and learned behavior. The scenes conducted in complete darkness force both characters and audience members to rely on auditory and tactile information to understand spatial relationships and immediate. The movie's examination of urban planning and community decay provides social commentary on how economic policies and residential patterns can create isolated environments where criminal activities and social dysfunction flourish without adequate intervention from authorities or community support systems. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods serve as both literal setting and metaphorical representation of how institutional failures create conditions that perpetuate cycles of violence and desperation across multiple generations. The story's treatment of gender expectations and sexual violence reveals how power dynamics and social vulnerabilities create specific dangers for female characters, while also showing how these same factors can be used strategically by women who understand the systems they must navigate. Rocky's gender makes her appear less threatening to Norman initially, while also making her vulnerable to his plans for sexual assault and forced pregnancy, demonstrating how the same characteristics can serve as both protection and liability depending on the specific circumstances involved. The film's exploration of communication strategies and psychological manipulation shows how characters use various forms of verbal and non-verbal interaction to gain tactical advantages, build relationships, or establish dominance in dangerous situations. Norman's limited dialogue during the invasion sequences reflects his tactical approach to eliminating threats, while his more extensive conversations with Rocky during her captivity. The movie's treatment of property rights and territorial behavior examines how people create and defend their personal domains while showing how the concept of ownership can become complicated when it involves stolen money or spaces used for criminal activities. Norman's house represents both legitimate property that he has the right to defend and a crime scene where serious felonies have been committed, creating legal and moral ambiguities that reflect broader questions about justice and self-defense. The story's examination of survival psychology reveals how extreme circumstances can transform ordinary people into individuals capable of both remarkable heroism and terrible violence depending on the immediate threats they face and the resources available to them. Alex's evolution from reluctant criminal to heroic protector demonstrates how moral character can emerge under pressure, while Norman's transformation from victim to predator shows how trauma and isolation can corrupt even those who have previously shown courage and honor. The film's treatment of disability adaptation and assistive technology shows how devices and modifications designed to help people with physical limitations can also serve defensive or tactical purposes when used by individuals with appropriate knowledge and training. Norman's familiarity with his home environment and his various adaptations for navigating without sight give him significant advantages over intruders who must rely on vision in conditions where lighting can be controlled by the person they are attempting to victimize. The movie's exploration of economic desperation and criminal motivation reveals how financial pressure can drive otherwise decent people toward increasingly dangerous and morally questionable behavior, while showing how the pursuit of money rarely provides the security and happiness that motivates such activity. The cash that drives the central conflict represents different things to different characters, from survival necessity for the young criminals to blood money for Norman. Yet none of them achieve lasting satisfaction or security through their pursuit of these funds. The story's treatment of military training and combat experience shows how skills learned in service to country can be adapted for civilian self-defense, while also raising questions about what happens when warriors return to civilian life without adequate support systems or meaningful ways to channel their abilities. Norman's tactical approach to defending his home reflects his military background, while his isolation and criminal behavior suggest that his transition to civilian life has been unsuccessful and damaging. The film's examination of parent-child relationships and protective instincts reveals how love for children can motivate both criminal behavior and acts of heroism, while showing how Rocky's devotion to her sister drives her participation in criminal activities that she might otherwise avoid, while Norman's grief over his daughter's death motivates his elaborate and twisted scheme for replacement through sexual violence and forced pregnancy. The movie's treatment of social isolation and community breakdown shows how the absence of strong social connections can create conditions where extreme behavior flourishes without adequate intervention or support from neighbors, friends, or community institutions. Norman's isolation in his abandoned neighborhood allows his crimes to continue undetected while contributing to his psychological deterioration, while the young criminal's lack of legitimate community connections leaves them with few alternatives to criminal activity for achieving their goals. The story's exploration of justice systems and legal processes reveals how formal mechanisms for addressing wrongdoing can fail both victims and perpetrators in ways that create conditions for vigilante behavior and criminal responses to perceived injustices. The inadequate punishment for Cindy Roberts creates the motivation for Norman's vigilante justice, while the police response to the home invasion focuses on immediate criminal acts rather than the broader pattern of crimes and victimization that created the situation. The film's treatment of substance abuse and family dysfunction provides context for Rocky's criminal behavior, while showing how these problems create intergenerational cycles that affect children who have no control over their family circumstances. Her mother's alcoholism and neglect create an environment where criminal activity appears to be the only viable means of escape, while her responsibility for her sister's welfare adds emotional urgency to her The movie's examination of consumer culture and material possessions reveals how the desire for economic security and social status can drive both criminal behavior and legitimate work, while showing how material goods rarely provide the emotional satisfaction or personal security that people seek through their acquisition. The various items stolen by the young criminals represent more than simple monetary value. They symbolize access to opportunities and lifestyles that seem otherwise impossible to achieve through legitimate means. The story's treatment of medical issues and healthcare access raises questions about how society supports those with disabilities or injuries, while showing how inadequate medical or psychological care can contribute to social problems and individual dysfunction. Norman's blindness and apparent mental health issues suggest ongoing medical needs that may not be adequately addressed by available healthcare systems, while the lack of proper support could contribute to his isolation and criminal behavior. The film's exploration of religious and spiritual themes appears primarily through Norman's apparent belief that his actions serve higher purposes of justice or divine retribution, while other characters show little evidence of spiritual or religious guidance in their moral decision-making. The absence of meaningful spiritual or ethical frameworks contributes to the moral confusion that affects all the characters, while suggesting that stronger moral education and community support might prevent much of the destructive behavior depicted in the story. The movie's complex examination of moral authority and who deserves to claim victim status becomes even more intricate when viewed through the lens of contemporary social justice movements and public discourse about crime and punishment. The film deliberately challenges audience assumptions about deserving victims and legitimate authority, forcing viewers to confront their own biases about age, disability, socioeconomic status, and criminal behavior, while questioning the institutional systems that shape public understanding of justice and accountability. The story's treatment of systemic inequality and institutional failure reveals how different forms of abandonment create the conditions for both criminal behavior and vigilante justice, suggesting that individual acts of violence often represent symptoms of broader social dysfunction, rather than simple moral failure. Norman's transformation from victim to perpetrator illustrates how inadequate institutional responses to trauma and injustice can corrupt even those who have served their communities with distinction, while the young criminal's activities represent another form of response to systems that have failed to provide legitimate opportunities for advancement and security. The film's exploration of competing victimhood narratives demonstrates how different characters can simultaneously occupy positions as both perpetrators and victims, depending on the specific context and time frame being examined. Rocky's status as a criminal who invades Norman's home conflicts with her role as a protective sister trying to escape an abusive family situation, while Norman's position as a disabled veteran who has suffered multiple injustices becomes complicated by his crimes against Cindy Roberts and his plans for Rocky. This moral complexity reflects real-world situations where clear distinctions between victims and perpetrators often prove victims. The movie's treatment of economic desperation and class warfare reveals how financial inequality creates conditions that drive both criminal behavior and public sympathy for those who break laws in pursuit of basic security and opportunity. The contrast between the wealthy Roberts family's ability to buy legal immunity for their daughter and the desperate circumstances that drive the young criminals toward increasingly dangerous behavior illustrates fundamental inequalities that shape access to justice, while influencing public perception of who deserves protection and who deserves punishment. The story's examination of disability representation and social prejudice shows how physical limitations can be simultaneously viewed as sources of vulnerability and potential threat, depending on the specific circumstances and the observer's perspective. Norman's blindness initially makes him appear to be an ideal victim for criminal activity, but his military training and tactical knowledge transform his disability into a strategist's vow. This reversal challenges common assumptions about helpless disabled people while avoiding the equally problematic tendency to present disability as a form of superpower or compensation. The film's treatment of veteran affairs and military service provides commentary on how society supports or abandons those who have sacrificed for their communities, particularly when they return with disabilities or psychological trauma that require Norman's isolation and apparent lack of adequate mental health services suggest institutional failures that contribute to his criminal behavior, while his military skills become resources that serve both defensive and predatory purposes depending on how they are employed in civilian contexts. The movie's exploration of gender dynamics and sexual violence adds layers of complexity to its examination of power relationships and social vulnerability, with Rocky's status as a young woman affecting how other characters respond to her, while also influencing her own strategic choices throughout the ordeal. Norman's plans for forced pregnancy represent perhaps the most disturbing element of his criminal behavior, transforming him definitively from potential victim to clear antagonist, while highlighting how sexual violence often represents attempts to exert control rather than expressions of desire or passion. The story's treatment of family relationships and protective instincts reveals how love for children and relatives can motivate both criminal behavior and acts of heroism, while showing how these same emotions can become corrupted when they encounter systems that fail to provide adequate protection or justice. Rocky's devotion to her sister drives her participation in increasingly dangerous criminal activities, while Norman's grief over his daughter's death motivates his elaborate scheme for replacement through sexual violence and imprisonment. The film's examination of urban decay and post-industrial decline provides context for the character's actions, while serving as a metaphor for broader social breakdown that creates conditions where extreme behavior can flourish without adequate intervention from community institutions or support systems. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods represent more than atmospheric setting. They symbolize the failure of American economic and social systems to provide security and opportunity for all citizens while creating environments where both criminal activity and vigilante justice can operate without detection. The movie's treatment of surveillance technology and security systems reveals how devices designed to protect people and property can also serve criminal purposes when used by those with appropriate technical knowledge and tactical understanding. Alex's access to security codes through his father's business provides the means for their criminal activities, while Norman's defensive modifications to his home serve both legitimate protection needs and his criminal enterprises, showing how the same technologies can serve multiple purposes depending on user intent. The story's exploration of mental health issues and psychological trauma avoids simple explanations while acknowledging how extreme experiences can permanently alter behavior and worldview in ways that contribute to both criminal activity and social dysfunction. Norman's elaborate criminal scheme suggests psychological damage that extends beyond normal grief or adjustment to disability, while the young criminal's activities may represent maladaptive responses to family trauma and economic stress that could be addressed through appropriate intervention and support services. The film's treatment of communication and language reveals how characters use speech and silence strategically to achieve tactical advantages, build relationships, or conceal information that might compromise their safety or objectives. Norman's limited dialogue during action sequences reflects his tactical approach to eliminating threats, while his conversations with Rocky reveal psychological states and motivations that help explain. The movie's examination of justice systems and legal processes shows how formal mechanisms for addressing wrongdoing can fail both victims and perpetrators in ways that create conditions for vigilante behavior and criminal responses to perceived injustices. The inadequate punishment for Cindy Roberts creates motivation for Norman's vigilante justice, while police response to the home invasion focuses on immediate criminal acts rather than broader patterns of crime and victimization that created the dangerous situation. The story's treatment of religious and spiritual themes appears primarily through Norman's apparent belief that his actions serve higher purposes of justice or divine retribution, while other characters show little evidence of spiritual guidance in their moral decision-making processes. The absence of meaningful ethical frameworks contributes to moral confusion that affects all characters while suggesting that stronger community support. The film's exploration of addiction and family dysfunction provides context for Rocky's criminal behavior, while showing how these problems create intergenerational cycles that affect children who have no control over their circumstances or family environments. Her mother's alcoholism and neglect create conditions where criminal activity appears to be the only viable means of escape, while her responsibility for her sister's welfare adds emotional urgency that drives her toward increasingly dangerous risks. The movie's treatment of media representation and public narrative control shows how institutional power shapes by determining which information becomes public, events by determining which information. The news coverage of the incident presents a simplified version that serves certain interests while ignoring crucial information about what actually occurred, reflecting broader patterns of how power influences public discourse about crime, justice, and social issues. The story's examination of property rights and territorial behavior reveals how concepts of ownership become complicated when they involve stolen money. Norman's house represents both legitimate property that he has rights to defend and a crime scene where serious felonies have been committed, creating legal and moral ambiguities that reflect broader questions about self-defense, property protection, and criminal justice responses to complex situations. The film's treatment of consumer culture and material possessions shows how the desire for economic security and social status can drive both legitimate work and criminal behavior, while revealing how material goods rarely provide the emotional satisfaction or personal security that people seek through their acquisition. The stolen items represent more than simple monetary value to the characters. They symbolize access to opportunities and lifestyles. The movie's exploration of survival psychology demonstrates how extreme circumstances can reveal hidden aspects of personality, while transforming ordinary people into individuals capable of both remarkable courage and terrible violence, depending on immediate threats and available resources. The characters' responses to mortal danger reveal fundamental aspects of their personalities, while showing how the film's sophisticated handling of moral complexity becomes most apparent in its refusal to provide audiences with clear heroes or villains, instead presenting characters whose actions exist in morally ambiguous territory that defies simple categorization. This approach forces viewers to confront their own assumptions about deserving victims and legitimate authority, while questioning how societal factors shape understanding of justice. The movie's exploration of competing victimhood narratives reveals how different characters can simultaneously occupy positions as both perpetrators and victims, depending on specific contexts and time frames being examined. Rocky's criminal activities conflict with her protective role toward her sister, while Norman's multiple victimizations by institutional systems become complicated by his own criminal behavior against Cindy and his plan. This moral complexity reflects real-world situations where clear distinctions between victims and perpetrators often prove insufficient for understanding multifaceted social problems. The story's treatment of institutional abandonment becomes particularly relevant when examining how various systems have failed each main character in different but interconnected ways. The criminal justice system failed Norman by providing inadequate punishment for his daughter's killer, while military institutions abandoned him after combat injuries left him disabled and traumatized. Economic systems have failed the young criminals by providing no legitimate paths to security, while social services apparently failed to protect Rocky's sister from family abuse. The film's examination of class dynamics and economic inequality reveals how financial disparities create conditions that drive criminal behavior, while shaping public perception of who deserves sympathy and protection. The contrast between the wealthy Roberts family's ability to purchase legal immunity and the desperate circumstances driving the young criminals illustrates fundamental inequalities affecting access to justice and opportunity. The movie's treatment of disability representation challenges stereotypes while avoiding equally problematic tendencies to romanticize physical limitations as sources of supernatural ability. Norman's blindness affects his capabilities realistically, while his adaptation through training provides advantages in familiar environments, creating nuanced portrayal that respects both disability, reality, and potential for empowerment, without falling into common representational traps. The story's exploration of veteran affairs and military service commentary shows how society supports or abandons those who have sacrificed for their community. Norman's isolation and apparent lack of mental health services suggest institutional failures contributing to his criminal behavior, while his military skills serve both defensive and predatory purposes depending on civilian application context. The film's treatment of gender dynamics and sexual violence adds complexity to power relationship examinations and social vulnerability assessments. Zero. Rocky's gender affects how characters respond to her, while influencing her strategic choices, while Norman's plans for forced pregnancy represent disturbing criminal behavior that transforms him definitively from victim to perpetrator, while highlighting how sexual violence often represents control, attempts rather than desire. The movie's examination of urban decay and post-industrial decline provides contextual framework while serving as metaphor for broader social breakdown, creating conditions where extreme behavior flourishes without adequate institutional intervention. Zero. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods symbolize American economic and social system failures, while creating environments where criminal activity and vigilante justice operate. The story's treatment of family relationships and protective instincts reveals how love for relatives can motivate both criminal behavior and heroic actions, while showing how these emotions become corrupted when encountering inadequate protection or justice system. Zero. Rocky's sister devotion drives dangerous criminal participation, while Norman's daughter grief motivates elaborate replacement schemes through sexual violence and imprisonment. The film's exploration of surveillance technology and security systems shows how protective devices can serve criminal purposes when used by those with technical knowledge and tactical understanding. Zero. Security access enables criminal activities while defensive home modifications serve both legitimate protection and criminal enterprises, demonstrating how identical technologies serve multiple purposes depending on user intentions and circumstance. The movie's treatment of mental health issues and psychological trauma avoids simple explanations while acknowledging how extreme experiences permanently alter behavior and worldview in ways contributing to criminal activity and social dysfunction. Zero. Norman's elaborate schemes suggest damage extending beyond normal grief, while criminal activities may represent maladaptive responses to family trauma and economic stress. Addressable fraud. The story's examination of communication strategies and psychological manipulation shows how characters use verbal and nonverbal interaction to gain tactical advantages while building relationships or concealing compromising information. Zero. Norman's limited dialogue reflects tactical threat elimination approaches, while conversations reveal psychological states, providing insight into motivations without excusing criminal behavior. The film's treatment of justice systems and legal processes reveals how formal wrongdoing mechanisms fail both victims and perpetrators in ways creating conditions for vigilante behavior and criminal responses to perceived injustice. Zero. Inadequate punishment creates vigilante motivation, while police responses focus on immediate acts rather than broader crime and victimization patterns, creating dangerous situations. The movie's exploration of religious and spiritual themes appears through Norman's apparent belief that his actions serve higher justice purposes, while other characters show little spiritual guidance in moral decision-making. Zero. Meaningful ethical framework absence contributes to moral confusion affecting all characters, while suggesting stronger community support and moral education might prevent destructive behavior. The story's treatment of addiction and family dysfunction provides criminal behavior context, while showing how problems create intergenerational cycles affecting children without control over circumstances. Zero. Maternal alcoholism and neglect create conditions where criminal activity appears as only viable escape means, while sister welfare responsibility adds emotional urgency driving dangerous risk-taking. The film's examination of media representation and public narrative control shows how institutional power shapes complex event understanding by determining information availability and presentation to broader audience. Zero. News coverage presents simplified versions serving certain interests, while ignoring crucial occurrence information, reflecting broader patterns of power influence on crime, justice, and social issue public discourse. The movie's treatment of property rights and territorial behavior reveals how ownership concepts become complicated, involving stolen money, criminal activities, or illegal purpose spaces. Zero. Norman's house represents both legitimate defendable property and serious felony crime scenes, creating legal and moral ambiguities, reflecting broader self-defense, property protection, and criminal justice questions about complex situation responses. The story's exploration of consumer culture and material possession shows how economic security and social status desires drive both legitimate work and criminal behavior, while revealing how material goods rarely provide emotional satisfaction or personal security sought through acquisitions era. The film's treatment of survival psychology demonstrates how extreme circumstances reveal hidden personality aspects while transforming ordinary people into individuals capable of remarkable courage and terrible violence depending on immediate threats and available resources. Zero. Character responses to mortal danger reveal fundamental personality aspects while showing how moral behavior becomes complicated. The movie's examination of moral authority and legitimate victim status becomes increasingly complex when viewed through contemporary social justice movements and public discourse about crime and punishment. The film challenges audience assumptions about deserving victims and legitimate authority, while questioning institutional systems shaping public understanding of justice and accountability in situations where the film's intricate psychological framework operates on multiple levels of moral complexity that challenge traditional ethical paradigms while forcing viewers to engage with questions about justice, victimhood, and institutional responsibility that extend far beyond the immediate narrative. The story creates opportunities for what researchers term character engagement and moral understanding. This engagement precipitates deeper moral reflection that continues beyond the viewing experience, creating what scholars identify as the reflective afterlife of cinema, where complex ethical questions persist in daily discourse and personal contemplation. The movie's exploration of moral ambiguity serves as a compelling storytelling device that delves deep into ethical challenges and the complexities of the human condition. The narrative confronts characters with difficult choices where their personal values and beliefs are rigorously tested, often exposing conflicting moral duties that have no clear resolution. This approach effectively engages audiences by sparking reflection and meaningful discussions about the consequences and significance of decisions that shape human lives, while challenging viewers to question their own ethical beliefs through engagement with character struggle. The film's treatment of moral dilemmas falls into multiple categories that shape narrative development and character growth in distinct ways. The ethical dilemmas challenge characters to choose between equally compelling options, weighing one right against another with no easy resolution, while personal struggles center on internal battles where characters must reconcile their beliefs. The societal conflicts confront characters with responsibilities to their communities, forcing balance between individual needs and collective well-being in ways that reflect broader cultural debates about justice and accountability. The story's sophisticated manipulation of audience sympathies demonstrates how films can cultivate empathy and moral understanding through careful character development and narrative structure. The parasocial relationships that viewers develop with characters become focal points for moral monitoring, where audiences gauge the propriety of character actions while wondering what they themselves would do in similar circumstances. This psychological engagement with fictional characters plays a crucial role in moral reasoning by providing simulations of complex social and ethical dilemmas that rarely have clear-cut solutions. The movie's exploration of heroic character development reveals how moral sensitivity increases, reasoning evolves, and character develops through confrontation with difficult ethical choices. Norman's journey from victim to perpetrator illustrates how trauma and institutional abandonment can corrupt moral judgment, while Rocky's evolution from criminal to survivor shows how extreme circumstances can reveal hidden strengths. These character arcs demonstrate that moral development often occurs through conflict and struggle rather than through simple adherence to established rules or principles. The film's treatment of moral emotions reveals how narrative engagement can elicit both positive and negative emotional responses that influence ethical behavior and understanding. The positive moral emotion of elevation occurs when observing virtuous behavior, motivating viewers to behave more virtuously themselves, while negative emotions like shame, guilt, and regret serve deterrent functions that discourage harmful actions. The complex moral landscape of the story elicits both types of responses simultaneously, creating emotional confusion that mirrors the ethical ambiguity of the situation. The movie's examination of institutional failure and social breakdown provides context for understanding how individual moral failures often reflect broader systemic problems that require collective rather than individual solutions. The abandoned neighborhoods of Detroit serve as both setting and symbol for how economic and social policies create conditions where extreme behavior flourishes without adequate intervention or support from community institutions. This environmental context suggests that moral education and character development require supportive social structures that help individuals navigate difficult situations without resorting to destructive behavior. The story's treatment of perspective and point of view reveals how moral judgment depends heavily on the information available and the standpoint from which events are interpreted. The film deliberately manipulates audience sympathies by controlling the revelation of information about character motivations and past actions, showing how moral assessment changes as understanding deepens. This technique demonstrates that ethical evaluation is often subjective and contextual rather than absolute, requiring careful consideration of all relevant factors before making definitive judgments about right and wrong behavior. The film's exploration of moral complexity through character psychology reveals how past traumas, subconscious desires, and fears contribute to morally ambiguous behavior that defies simple categorization. Norman's military service and combat trauma provide context for understanding his tactical skills and paranoid behavior, while his grief over his daughter's death explains his obsession with replacement and revenge. These psychological factors do not excuse his criminal actions, but they provide understanding of how moral reasoning can become corrupted by extreme experiences and inadequate support systems. The movie's treatment of cultural and societal influences on moral development shows how community values, economic pressures, and institutional structures shape individual ethical choices in fundamental ways. The contrast between the wealthy Roberts family's ability to avoid consequences and the desperate circumstances driving the young criminals illustrates how social inequality affects access to justice and legitimate opportunities for advancement. This analysis suggests that effective moral education must address systemic inequalities, rather than focusing exclusively on individual character development. The story's examination of moral authority and legitimacy questions who has the right to make ethical judgments and enforce moral standards when institutional systems prove inadequate or corrupt. Norman's vigilante justice represents one response to legal system failures, while the young criminal's activities represent another form of self-help in response to economic system inadequacy. The film suggests that moral authority becomes complicated when official systems fail to provide adequate protection or justice for vulnerable populations. The film's treatment of redemption and moral transformation explores whether people who have committed terrible acts can change their behavior and deserve second chances despite past actions. Rocky's journey from criminal to survivor suggests potential for moral growth and change, while Norman's persistence in criminal behavior despite opportunities for different choices shows how some individuals become trapped in destructive patterns. This contrast raises questions about what factors enable moral transformation versus those that prevent it. The movie's exploration of community and social connection reveals how isolation and abandonment can contribute to moral breakdown, while supportive relationships can enable ethical behavior even under extreme circumstances. Norman's isolation in his abandoned neighborhood contributes to his psychological deterioration and criminal activity, while Rocky's love for her sister provides moral motivation that prevents her from complete descent into purely selfish behavior. These contrasts suggest that moral development requires community support and meaningful relationships with others. The story's treatment of moral education and ethical development examines how people learn to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior when traditional sources of guidance prove inadequate or absent. The character's various moral failures suggest that effective ethical education requires more than simple rule following, instead demanding critical thinking skills that enable navigation of complex situations where different values come into conflict. The film implies that moral education must prepare individuals to make difficult choices rather than simply memorizing prescribed behaviors. The film's examination of moral complexity through narrative structure demonstrates how sophisticated storytelling can engage audiences in ethical reflection that extends beyond entertainment into personal and social transformation. The story's refusal to provide clear heroes or villains forces viewers to grapple with difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and forgiveness that have no easy answers. This approach to moral storytelling suggests that cinema can serve educational functions by providing safe spaces for exploring ethical dilemmas that might be too dangerous or costly to experience directly in real-life situations.